Moonlight reveals more than shadows. It leaves marks of truth. Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host, Ravela. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. I love hearing from you. Let's step on to the stair. It was a Tuesday evening in late November when the quiet of our Baker Street lodgings was broken by the heavy knock of a visitor. Outside, the London fog had settled like a damp grey veil across the gaslit streets, and I had just poured Holmes his second cup of tea when the door below resounded with a firm rap, one that spoke of urgency rather than politeness. Mrs. Hudson admitted the caller, a tall, austere gentleman whose appearance was at odds with the hour and the weather. His overcoat was finely cut, though smeared with soot at the hem, and beneath his hat, streaks of silver threaded his dark hair, accentuating the hollowness of his pale face. The man entered our room with a certain stiffness, as though he resented the very circumstances that had brought him here. "My name is Sir Alistair Graythorne," he announced, removing his gloves but not offering his hand. "I require the services of Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "You have found him," Holmes replied, remaining in his armchair by the fire. He regarded the visitor with his usual piercing detachment, his steepled fingers forming a small cathedral beneath his chin. "Pray, what misfortune has led a baronet to my door at such an hour and in such a condition?" Sir Alistair hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "It concerns an incident at Graythorne House, my family estate in Hampshire. A death, unnatural, though not as yet formally recognized as such." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "Start at the beginning. There was a gathering at the house this weekend. A few friends, my sister Lady Caroline, and an old acquaintance, Professor Julian Ellerby. On Sunday evening, around 10:30, my nephew, Philip Graythorne, was found dead at the foot of the west stairwell. His neck was broken. The local coroner ruled it a tragic fall." "And you disagree?" "I am certain of it," Sir Alistair said, his voice tight. "There were peculiar marks on the staircase, smudged impressions on the upper banister like fingerprints in soot, and a small shard of glass was found embedded in Philip's palm." Holmes's eyes glittered. "What became of the shard?" "I brought it with me." Sir Alistair produced a small envelope from his coat pocket. Holmes received it with delicate precision, holding it up to the lamp. "It appears curved," Holmes murmured. "Not window glass, possibly a lens. Intriguing." "What troubles me most," Sir Alistair continued, lowering his voice, "is that Philip had confided in me, days before, that he suspected someone was watching him at night. He claimed to see a figure moving past the moonlit landing. But when he pursued it, he found no one. I presume you searched." "Of course." "Nothing. But last night, after the house had quieted, I myself heard footsteps on that same stair. Yet when I opened my door, nothing, only the faint smell of burning wax and those same smudged marks, as if someone or something had passed through again." There was a silence then, broken only by the low whistle of wind against the window pane. Holmes sat forward. "Sir Alistair," he said, "you mentioned a Professor Julian Ellerby." "The name is known to me. Astronomer, lecturer at St. John's. A curious man, if I recall. He recently published a treatise on optical illusions and lunar phenomena." Sir Alistair blinked in surprise. "He did, yes. Philip had taken a great interest in it. He said it had altered his perspective on more than just astronomy." Holmes stood abruptly. "Watson, you'll pack your bag. We leave for Hampshire on the 9 o'clock train." "And what do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked, noting the gleam in his eyes. He turned to me with that familiar half-smile. "A man dead by accident is a dull matter. But when the fall occurs beneath a waxing moon, on a stair marked by phantom hands and whispers of invisible watchers, Watson, that is a puzzle with teeth. The game, as they say, is afoot." The following morning was raw with mist as we boarded the southbound train to Hampshire. Holmes had said little during our preparations, though his eyes rarely left the small shard of curved glass, which he now held between thumb and forefinger, like a sacred relic. He had packed swiftly, an unusual efficiency that suggested how deeply the case had seized his interest. As the train rumbled through the countryside, he finally stirred from his long silence. "You noticed, of course, Watson, the inconsistency in Sir Alister's account." "I must admit, Holmes, I noticed only its curious nature, not any contradictions." Holmes smiled faintly. "No contradiction, just an omission. A staircase is a static thing. If there are marks on it one day and they reappear another, then either someone is deliberately recreating them or they were never removed to begin with. Sir Alister made no mention of cleaning them away after Philip's death. If they remain, then no supernatural recurrence has occurred. If they were cleaned and reappeared, then someone wishes to simulate the illusion of a haunting presence. You believe the haunting is staged?" "I believe someone wants to be believed," Holmes said cryptically, "which is not at all the same as telling the truth." We arrived at Greythorn House shortly after noon. It was an imposing estate built in the Jacobean style, crouched atop a low hill and framed by leafless oaks. A weathered stone fountain, dry and cracked, sat at the center of the gravel courtyard, and from its basin sprouted a clutch of dead vines, long since given over to the autumn chill. Sir Alister received us personally. His manner had shifted subtly since the previous evening, more guarded now, as if unsure whether he had acted in wisdom or desperation by seeking Holmes's aid. "You will find the house, not quite itself," he said as he led us through the high-ceilinged hall. "Since Philip's death, the atmosphere has become strained. Caroline refuses to speak of it, and Professor Ellerby remains cloistered in the observatory tower. The others departed after the inquest." Holmes nodded, his eyes scanning the tapestries and portraits that lined the passage. "And the staircase?" "This way." The west stairwell branched from the main hall, its lower steps shadowed by the overhang of an ornate gallery. A grand window stood on the landing, its glass throwing pale grey light across the banister. Even before we drew close, Holmes motioned for me to halt. "Observe, Watson. From this distance, what strikes you?" I squinted. Dust on the steps. Perhaps some faint scuff marks? "Precisely. Now come." We ascended slowly. About halfway up the stair, Holmes knelt and removed a small lens from his coat pocket. He inspected the banister minutely. "Here are the smudges," he murmured. "Not quite fingerprints, but impressions of a palm or partial grip. The direction suggests someone descending quickly, likely our unfortunate Mr. Greythorn. Could these not have been made during the fall?" "Not with such clarity. A man falling headlong does not reach backward to steady himself. More likely, these were made earlier. And here." He pointed to a darker blotch near the upper edge of the rail. "Burnt wax," as Sir Alister reported. Just then, a voice called sharply from above. "Whatever are you doing?" A woman stood at the top of the stair. She was striking, with auburn hair pinned in a loose coil and a shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. Her bearing was that of someone who had once known laughter and had now sworn it off. "Lady Caroline," Sir Alister said stiffly, "this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes." She descended with an air of cool disapproval. "The detective. I suppose we are to be poked and prodded like a row of curiosities." Holmes bowed slightly. "Only as much as necessary, Lady Caroline." She studied him, then turned to the stair. "I have not walked this flight since it happened. My nephew was a foolish boy, restless, easily distracted. He could barely climb a step without losing his balance." "You believe it an accident, then?" Holmes asked. "I believe nothing," she said curtly. "Belief implies certainty, and this house has grown quite devoid of that." She turned on her heel and walked off without another word. Sir Alister sighed. "You'll excuse her. Caroline and Philip were close." Holmes nodded absently, already absorbed again in the steps. Did she accompany Philip at all the evening he died? Number she was in her room by 10. Professor Ellaby saw him last. They had a minor disagreement over supper, nothing serious, but the professor retired early. Philip was left alone in the drawing room. And the shard of glass? Sir Alister hesitated. It was found embedded in his right palm. No broken glass nearby. We thought it had perhaps been on the stair, from a dropped lamp or such. Holmes made no reply, but his face became inscrutable. We were shown to our rooms and allowed a few hours' rest, during which Holmes refused even to sit. He wandered the halls like a pacing hawk, studying sconces, rugs, thresholds, and the contents of the downstairs drawing room. I found him there at dusk, peering into the fireplace with the curious expression of a man waiting for it to speak. "There is something missing, Watson," he said quietly. Missing? Not an object, a feeling. A house such as this, with such guests, should reek with the remains of conversation, laughter, conflict, chatter. But it is hollow. Everyone here is either watching or hiding. He paused. "Tell me, Watson, have you ever read of the theory of staged accidents? You mean deliberate acts disguised as chance misfortunes?" "Exactly. To push a man from a stair and make it seem he tripped, that requires opportunity, courage, and a subtle hand. But to arrange the environment so that the victim brings about his own death by manipulation or misdirection, now that is artistry, and far more difficult to detect." At that moment, a bell chimed sharply in the corridor beyond, and footsteps followed, brisk, uneven. A gaunt man in a buttoned frock coat and with spectacles perched precariously on his brow appeared in the doorway. His eyes darted nervously as he spotted us. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, I presume?" he said. "Professor Julian Ellerbay. I was told you might wish to speak with me." Holmes rose. "Indeed. I've read your recent paper on refracted lunar shadows and spatial perception. A brilliant work." Ellerby's cheeks flushed. "You've read it?" Holmes gave a courteous nod. "I understand you were one of the last to see Mr. Graythorne alive." "I was. We discussed my paper after dinner. He was fascinated. Perhaps too much so. He said he had been seeing shadows on the stair, shapes that moved only in moonlight. He asked if such illusions were possible." "And your answer?" I told him yes. The brain is easily deceived by contrast and light. But Mr. Holmes, he was not well, distracted. He mentioned something about having uncovered a secret, though he would not say more. He was obsessed with the stair. Holmes looked sharply at him. "Did he mention what kind of secret?" "Number only that it had to do with a visitor he believed was sneaking into the house at night. A woman, he said, though no one else saw her." Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Watson, tonight we will walk the Moonlit Stair ourselves. I wish to see what fascinated Philip so completely, what he thought he saw before he died. For in the dance between shadow and light, something moved with intent, and we must discover whether it was ghost, illusion, or murderer." The moon was high by the time Holmes and I stepped quietly from our rooms, the house slumbering in thick silence. Graythorne House, vast and darkened, seemed to hum with unsaid things, each creaking floorboard and wavering shadow carrying the breath of untold secrets. Holmes had insisted we wait until the precise hour Philip Graythorne was believed to have met his end. For such phenomena, he remarked, are often bound not to mere place, but time. We moved without lanterns. Holmes, gliding with unnatural precision, led us through the corridor toward the west stair, his eyes flicking upward every few steps. The long gallery stretched before us like a corridor of whispers, portraits looming and hollow-eyed, and the cool light of the moon fell in a narrow shaft through the landing's tall window. We paused at the base of the stair. "There," Holmes murmured, pointing upward. "The moonlight. See how it crosses the upper steps? Not uniformly, but in a narrow arc, bent just so by the window glass. Notice that distortion. I looked. Indeed, the moon's beam struck the middle landing unevenly, casting an odd curve against the banister. As we climbed, Holmes motioned for me to stop halfway. "Remain still," he whispered, crouching low. "Watch that patch of light. Tell me what you see." I stared. At first, nothing, just the soft gleam across wood. Then, slowly, a shadow began to creep into the frame. My breath caught. It was slight, little more than a flickering suggestion, but distinct. A faint, angled mark like a person's outline. No, not a person precisely, but a distortion shaped like one, appeared in the moonbeam, lingering for but a second before vanishing. "You saw it?" Holmes asked, his voice low and taut. "Yes." "What was it?" He straightened. "That, Watson, is a projected image, though not a deliberate one, a natural one, caused by the refraction of light through flawed glass. Likely the result of the small upper pane's warping. It is an image without a source, or rather, with a source far removed. An illusion. It could easily give the impression of a moving figure if one were already primed to see such a thing. You believe Philip was misled by that? Perhaps. Or perhaps someone ensured that he was. We ascended to the landing. Holmes examined the window closely, then withdrew a small folding glass and held it up to the pane. After a few minutes, he nodded to himself. "Look here, Watson. See that imperfection in the lead lattice? The upper right diamond, a slight warp. That would account for the curvature. And note this." He pointed to a faint residue near the sill. "Wax, faint but present. Candle wax, not long cooled. Someone stood here with a candle. More than once. To what end? To create a scene. Consider, the illusion only appears when the moon is high. But if someone were to stage such a shadow with a real figure, placed here with a light source from below, they could mimic it at will. Enough to convince an impressionable mind that the stair was haunted. Combine that with whispered warnings, perhaps unsettling remarks, and you might nudge a man to the edge of panic or action. A floorboard creaked behind us. We turned sharply. From the shadows beyond the landing emerged the wiry figure of Professor Ellerby, a dressing gown draped over his clothes and his spectacles glinting in the dim light. "I suspected you'd be exploring," he said, stepping forward. "May I ask what you found?" Holmes raised a brow. "A ghost of sorts, but not one from the beyond." Ellerby smiled nervously. "I did warn Philip about the illusions, but he was fixated. He insisted someone was trying to frighten him." "And was someone?" Holmes asked pointedly. Ellerby hesitated. He seemed to think so, but I assumed it was drink or imagination. He'd begun to talk of inheritance, of old family secrets. He fancied himself at the center of a drama. Holmes tilted his head. Inheritance. Yes. Philip was due to receive a significant portion of the Greythorn estate on his 25th birthday. 3 weeks from now. Until then, everything remains with Sir Alistair. Holmes said nothing for a moment, then turned abruptly and descended the stair. We returned to the drawing room. Holmes lit the fire with a deliberate hand and sank into one of the deep chairs, fingers laced beneath his chin. "Watson, the web is beginning to show. Let us consider our players. We have a young man growing increasingly paranoid, convinced someone is toying with him. A curious death, an apparent fall. Marks on the stair, wax residue, a piece of curved glass in his palm, and now motive, inheritance, secrets, and perhaps fear driven to fatal consequence." Ellerby remained standing, arms crossed. "And where do I fall in your web, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes did not look at him. "That depends, Professor, on one more thing. The shard. You're an astronomer. You work with lenses, slides, precision glass." Ellerby stiffened. "Yes." "Could this shard be part of such equipment?" Ellerby walked slowly to the mantel and looked into the flames. "It could be. I had a small parabolic lens go missing last week. I assumed I had mislaid it during a demonstration, but now—" Holmes leaned forward. "You never reported this?" "I didn't think it important." Holmes rose and moved to stand before him. "Let us not insult one another, Professor. The only thing more telling than an inconsistency is an omission. The shard found in Philip's palm matches precisely the curvature of an astronomer's viewing lens. Yet, he died nowhere near your study. Either the shard was carried there, or someone placed it to suggest a fall near broken glass. Convenient, is it not?" Ellerby's lips thinned, but he said nothing. Holmes paced slowly. "Suppose this. Philip discovers he is being manipulated. He suspects someone in the house, perhaps even you. He confronts you. There is an argument, perhaps a scuffle. You panic, or perhaps you do not. Perhaps it is cold calculation. You lead him to believe the stair is haunted. You let paranoia do your work. When he finally tumbles to his death, the marks and the light do the rest." Ellerby shook his head. "Number, I never meant—" "I didn't push him." Holmes stopped. "But you admit to staging the illusion." I thought it harmless. A demonstration. He asked about optical illusions. I wanted to show him." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, make note. The difference between influence and intention is where the law begins to lose patience." At that moment, Sir Alister appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Holmes, you had better come. There's been another incident." We followed him without delay, crossing the hall to the library. There, slumped over the writing desk, was a woman in a nightdress. Lady Caroline. She was unconscious, a half-empty glass of brandy at her elbow. Holmes bent over her, sniffed the contents and frowned. "Laudanum. Heavy dose, but not fatal. Get her to her room, quickly." She said nothing before collapsing. Alister murmured. Only that Philip was right. Holmes straightened. "We must speak to her as soon as she recovers. Something has stirred the house into confession, and if I am correct, Lady Caroline holds the key to what truly happened on the Moonlit Stair." Lady Caroline regained consciousness just past dawn. Holmes and I were summoned to her chambers, a somber room on the east wing of the house, where heavy velvet drapes muffled the morning light and a faint medicinal smell lingered in the air. She lay propped against a stack of pillows, her complexion still ashen but her eyes sharp with restrained emotion. A nurse stood discreetly to one side, and Sir Alister paced the far end of the room with a tight expression, as though uncertain whether he had invited salvation or ruin. Holmes approached the bedside with a gentleness that belied his often unsentimental manner. "Lady Caroline," he said, "you spoke before you collapsed. Something about Philip being right. Might I ask what you meant?" She studied him for a moment, then turned her face slightly away. "I should have listened to him," she murmured. "I thought he was being dramatic, delusional even. He told me someone was trying to frighten him, to make him believe he was losing his mind. He said there were lies beneath this roof, secrets that would be his undoing." "And did he say who he believed was behind it?" Holmes asked. She hesitated. "Not directly, but I think he suspected Julian and someone else. A woman." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "A woman? Did he give a name?" "No," she whispered, closing her eyes briefly. "But he mentioned voices in the night. He said he overheard a conversation outside the library, someone mentioning a letter. He tried to confront them, but they fled before he could see who it was. He was certain it related to our family's will." Holmes glanced quickly at Sir Alister, who remained stonily silent. "A letter," Holmes repeated. "Do you know of any correspondence Philip might have found troubling?" Caroline turned her gaze toward the fire. "There was something," she said slowly. "A week before his death, Philip came to me with a folded piece of paper. It looked old. He said he discovered it hidden behind one of the books in the study. He seemed shaken. I asked to see it, but he said he needed to understand it first, that it could change everything. He never showed it to me. And what became of it? I don't know, she said faintly. I believe it vanished the night he died. Holmes rose. Thank you, Lady Caroline. Rest now. You have been most helpful. Outside the room, Holmes strode briskly toward the main staircase, his coat billowing behind him like a banner of resolve. We must search the study again, he said. That letter is a keystone. Either the truth lies within it, or it was deemed dangerous enough to remove. The study was a tall, oak-paneled chamber lined with bookcases and dominated by a central desk beneath a tall window. Holmes closed the door behind us and began methodically scanning the shelves, running his fingers along the spines, tapping wood panels, tugging at books seemingly at random. I have found, he said as he moved, that secrets prefer the company of dusty volumes. It flatters their illusion of permanence. Within minutes, his hand paused on a thick, leather-bound volume. Sir Francis Bacon, Essays and Maxims. He withdrew it, inspected the cover, then opened it. "Ha," he said quietly, and drew forth a folded slip of parchment, brittle with age, wedged between the pages. It bore a faded crest and was sealed in a cracked envelope. He opened it and read quickly. His brows lifted. "Watson, this changes matters. It is a codicil, an unsigned draft to an older will, dated 15 years ago. It explicitly disinherits a branch of the Graythorne family in favor of a child, born out of wedlock, the child of C.H. and A.G. Those initials? Caroline and Alistair Graythorne, brother and sister. That is a fiction." He handed me the page. "Good heavens," I said. "You mean Caroline and Alistair are not siblings?" Holmes nodded grimly. "It appears not. They have presented themselves so for decades, perhaps to obscure a scandal. But this codicil implies something far more complex. A second heir, concealed. If Philip discovered this letter, he might have realized that his own claim to the inheritance was not as secure as he believed. He may have even suspected that someone in the house was that hidden child. There was a knock at the door. Ellaby entered, his expression tight. He carried a folded newspaper under his arm. "I thought you should see this," he said, offering it to Holmes. "The Morning Gazette. There's an obituary posted today, one that caught my eye." Holmes scanned it. His mouth twitched. "A woman named Beatrice Langdon," he said, "recently deceased. Former governess to the Graythorne household. Died at St. Bridget's Hospital, just days after Philip's death. Curiously convenient timing. She was dismissed quietly some years ago," Ellaby added. "No one spoke of it. Rumor had it she had a disagreement with Sir Alistair over matters of family conduct." Holmes folded the paper. "It is becoming very clear, Professor, that the walls of this house were built not merely of stone and timber, but of lies. Lies and blood." We returned to the west stair one final time before lunch. The landing lay in its familiar silence, moonlight now replaced by the washed grays of daylight. Holmes studied the window and the floor once more, then knelt by the base of the banister. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to a groove in the wood. "Fresh scoring. Watson, would you say this is consistent with something metallic?" I knelt beside him. "Possibly. A wire or hook of some kind." Holmes stood slowly. Someone prepared this site. Someone constructed an apparatus, perhaps rigged to startle or even cause a fall. But more telling is what they did not do. They failed to remove all the evidence. We returned to the drawing room where Sir Alistair waited. His expression was unreadable. "Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, "do you have something to report?" "I do," Holmes replied. "But it is not yet a conclusion. It is a narrowing. I believe Philip Graythorne uncovered a long-buried secret. I believe he discovered the codicil hidden in the Bacon volume, suggesting that someone else, not he, was the rightful heir. I believe he confronted at least one person about it, possibly the very person who stood to lose the most from the truth. And I believe someone used fear, perhaps even a physical trap, to hasten his downfall. Sir Alister's jaw tightened. And do you accuse me? I accuse no one yet. But I intend to find the one who staged the ghost, and once I do, I suspect the rest will unravel in short order. That evening, Holmes disappeared for several hours, returning only after sunset. When I inquired where he had gone, he simply said, "To the village." And to the hospital. What did you find? A name and a birth record. Beatrice Langdon, deceased governess, was once the guardian of a child born at the edge of scandal, the child of Caroline Graythorne and a suitor whose name was expunged from the registry. The child lived under another name. Raised here. Grew up believing a fiction. Holmes turned his gaze toward the darkened corridor. The child is still in this house. I stared at him. You mean, yes, Holmes said. And that child may well have believed Philip stood between them and their rightful legacy. The Moonlit Stair was merely the instrument. The motive was written in blood long before. Holmes did not sleep that night. I heard his footsteps crossing and recrossing the floor above long after midnight had passed. He was thinking, assembling pieces of a puzzle that refused, so far, to show its full shape. When morning broke over the misty grounds of Graythorne House, he was already dressed, seated by the hearth, his eyes red-rimmed but alight with focus. "Watson," he said as I joined him at breakfast, "we are close, very close. The architecture of deceit here is almost beautiful in its ambition, but like all carefully painted facades, there is one crack too many. Have you come to a conclusion?" "Almost, but there remains one question I cannot yet answer. Who among these people truly knows they are the child mentioned in the codicil? You still believe that person is here in the house?" "I am certain of it," he replied. "And it is not Caroline. Her knowledge is emotional, guilt-ridden, yes, but not grounded in full awareness. Nor is it Alistair. He's desperate to maintain the Graythorne name, not supplant it. No, someone else discovered the truth more recently, perhaps through Philip's own investigation. Someone with both motive and knowledge." Before I could speak further, Mrs. Hudson, the temporary housekeeper hired in light of the original staff's absence, knocked discreetly at the door. "Beg pardon, gentlemen," she said, "but Mr. Ellerby asked that you join him at the observatory. He says it's urgent." Holmes rose instantly. "Good. It's time we looked through the other end of the telescope." We found Professor Ellerby pacing the narrow confines of the Tower Observatory. Charts and maps of the stars lined the curved walls, and in the center, a large refracting telescope pointed eastward, angled awkwardly as if hastily adjusted. He turned to us with unease in his expression. "Mr. Holmes, there's something I neglected to mention." Holmes said nothing, only folded his arms. Ellerby swallowed. "The night Philip died, I left my room for air, around 10:30. I walked the upper corridor near the gallery that overlooks the west stair. I saw someone, just a glimpse, coming down the staircase, fast, a woman." Holmes didn't flinch. "Describe her." "Dark hair, slender. She wore a pale dressing gown. I assumed it was Lady Caroline." "You assumed, but you didn't confirm." Ellerby shook his head. "I went back to my room. I didn't want to be involved. But now the walls are closing in," Holmes murmured. "And you realize silence will no longer keep you safe." "I didn't harm him," Ellerby said quickly. "I wouldn't. I respected Philip. But I feared being implicated. We'd argued earlier that day, and I didn't want to draw attention. You say she was descending the stairs. Was Philip already dead by then?" "I can't say. I didn't look, but the time, it must have been just minutes before the alarm was raised." Holmes turned away, pacing to the telescope. He adjusted the eyepiece idly as he spoke. "You've helped more than you know. Tell me, Professor, who else had access to this room?" "No one. It's locked. I keep the key. Holmes examined the desk beside the telescope. Papers, star charts, a set of glass slides in velvet cases. Curved glass, he murmured, of the same make as the shard found in Philip's palm. Tell me, do you recall when that lens went missing? 2 nights before the fall, Ellerby said. I'd left a set on the table here. One was gone in the morning. Not an accident, Holmes said. A deliberate choice. Someone knew how to repurpose it, to create a plausible trace of a fall, to imply broken glass. Someone precise. Someone clever. He turned abruptly. I need access to the house's archives. Family records, journals, letters. There's a cabinet in the library, Ellerby offered. I believe it's locked. Holmes's mouth twitched. Then let's hope it's a lock worth picking. Back in the library, Holmes knelt before a long, iron-bound cabinet built into the wood paneling. With a deft flick of his tools, an old silver set he often carried tucked in the lining of his coat, he had the lock sprung in moments. The doors creaked open to reveal files, envelopes, deeds, and yellowing volumes of correspondence. He poured through them quickly but carefully. At last, he pulled out a slim green ledger marked Household Matters, 1878 to 1884. A governess's record, he said. Entries signed by Beatrice Langdon. He scanned quickly, then stopped on a page dated May 1882. Caroline remains ill. Has not left her room in days. Dr. Ellesmere says she is recovering well, though secrecy remains vital. The infant is to be given into Beatrice's personal custody. The master has arranged papers for travel, baby to be registered as Beatrice's niece. The father's name is to remain struck from the record. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Here it is. This child, hidden away, born of Caroline, raised under another identity. Now the question becomes, where did Beatrice go? And did the child remain nearby? He read further, lips moving. Wait, yes. Arrangements made with Mrs. Hargrave in Lark Hill, child to be named. He stopped. Well? I asked. Holmes stared at the name, then folded the ledger shut. We must speak with Lady Caroline again. We found her sitting in a high-backed chair by her window, the morning sun warming her cheeks. She looked older than she had the day before, and something in her eyes suggested resignation. Holmes stepped forward and knelt beside her, not dramatically, but with the quiet gravity of one who means to be heard. Lady Caroline, he said gently, you had a child, did you not? Born in secret, raised in another home. Her eyes filled, but she said nothing. I've seen the record. I believe Philip discovered the truth. He uncovered the codicil, the family deception, and perhaps even the identity of the child. But he never realized how close that child had grown. Caroline's voice came low and broken. He confronted me. Not in anger, in disbelief. He asked if it were true. I begged him to keep silent. For the family's sake. For hers, Holmes's voice did not waver. And who is she? A long pause. Then, almost inaudibly, Clara. Clara Hudson. She's Mrs. Hudson's niece, yes, but not by blood. Beatrice raised her here as a housemaid's ward. No one questioned it. I drew breath. But Mrs. Hudson is a local, Caroline nodded. She helped Beatrice protect her. Clara grew up within reach of her inheritance, never knowing it. Holmes stood. Then Clara learned the truth, perhaps through Beatrice, or through something Philip said, and she saw her birthright in peril. A knock interrupted us. A footman entered. Sir, there's been a disturbance in the West Stair corridor. Holmes and I hurried down. There, near the landing, stood Clara, pale, trembling, her hands clenched, and beside her on the ground lay a coiled length of wire and a shattered candle holder. She looked up as we approached, eyes wide with dread. You knew, Holmes said softly. I didn't mean to kill him, she whispered. I just wanted to scare him, make him doubt. He said he would destroy the letter, that he'd tell no one, but I didn't believe him. I thought he'd take everything, everything that should have been mine." Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Finally, "You built the illusion well. Too well. But you overlooked one thing. Truth finds a way through even the thickest shadow. The marks on the stair, the missing lens, the wax, all tiny truths pointing her." Tears spilled down her face. "I only wanted to be seen." Holmes stepped aside as Sir Alister arrived behind us. Holmes did not look at him. "See that she is not harmed," he said quietly. "She is, after all, one of your own." Sir Alister stood frozen, his eyes fixed not on Clara, but on the fallen coil of wire at her feet, its presence more damning than any spoken confession. For a moment, no one moved. Even the house itself seemed to hold its breath, the silence thick with the weight of legacy and ruin. Then Clara spoke again, her voice low, ragged with shame. "I didn't want to hurt him. I only wanted him to be afraid, to hesitate. I thought, if he doubted himself, if he started to break down, someone might question his claim to the inheritance. That maybe someone would remember me." Holmes did not respond immediately. He walked slowly past her to the window where the light had so often distorted itself in curious patterns. His eyes scanned the sill, then the floor, as if reconfirming every step of her calculated deception. "The illusion you created," he said at last, "was quite sophisticated. Wax placed deliberately, wire fixed to the banister to suggest a trip or stumble, and the missing lens, used perhaps to feign the presence of shattered glass from a fall. You didn't simply seek to frighten Philip. You recreated an entire narrative, one designed to push him to the edge of reason." Clara bowed her head. "He found the letter. He confronted Lady Caroline. I overheard. Then he came to me. He'd figured it out. He asked me gently if I knew. I denied it. But later, in the gallery, I saw him standing there at the top of the stair, holding the page. I panicked." "You were already in motion before that," Holmes said, turning. "The shadow plays, the footsteps in the night, the planted wax, all began before the confrontation. You had decided to act long before he knew the truth, but in the end, it was your silence that doomed him. When he stepped forward, whether by accident or in fear, you let him fall." Clara's shoulders sagged under the truth. Holmes's tone, though measured, lost none of its finality. "It may not have been your hand that pushed him, but it was your trap that awaited him." At Holmes's instruction, Sir Alister summoned the local magistrate. Clara did not resist. She followed without protest, a ghost of herself now, no longer the clever maid hiding in plain sight, but the forgotten heir revealed too late, too tragically. Once she was gone, silence fell once more in the corridor. Holmes stood by the stair for a long time, his gaze fixed on the moonlight filtering through the upper window, as if retracing the arc of every lie that had descended these steps. I moved to his side. "You don't believe she intended murder." "I believe," he said slowly, "that intention matters little when the design invites disaster. Clara believed she could control fear, plant it like a seed, let it bloom without consequence. But fear is not a tame thing. It grows wild, twists the mind, and often consumes more than its creator imagined." We returned to the drawing room, where Lady Caroline waited, seated in silence by the unlit hearth. She looked up as we entered, eyes rimmed with weariness. "She's gone, then?" "Yes," Holmes said quietly. "I wanted to protect her. After Beatrice died, Clara was so alone. She always believed herself to be just another servant's child, and I never had the courage to tell her otherwise." Holmes gave a small nod. "Your instinct to shield her was understandable, but secrets are like shadows cast by flame, long and shifting. Sooner or later they stretch too far to conceal." She looked toward the fire grate. "Philip was kind to her. If he'd had more time, perhaps he would have helped her find her place. Perhaps, Holmes replied. Then after a beat, but inheritance is not only of blood and title, Lady Caroline. Sometimes we pass along grief and silence as well. The next morning, as the last of the constables departed with Clara in their custody, Holmes and I prepared to leave. The sun had finally broken through the ever-present Hampshire mist, and the grounds of Greythorn looked almost gentle, as if relieved by the shedding of its secrets. We stood in the front hall as Sir Alister joined us. "Mr. Holmes," he said stiffly, "you have my thanks. I cannot pretend this is the ending I wished for, but I see now it may be the one the truth demanded." Holmes gave a small bow. "You may consider, Sir Alister, whether the truth might have demanded less, had it been allowed daylight from the beginning." Alister looked away, lips thin. "And what do you suppose I do now?" "Tell the full story, publicly or privately, but fully. Let Clara's name be remembered not as a culprit, but as a symptom of a broken legacy, and ensure that your house does not repeat the pattern." As we stepped outside, Holmes paused at the edge of the grand staircase, glancing once more toward the upper landing. "You know, Watson," he said as we descended, "I'm always struck by how murder rarely announces itself with a weapon. More often, it begins as a whisper, a choice to lie, a decision to let another suffer in silence. Do you think Clara knew it would end this way?" "No," he said, "but she underestimated the ghost she created, and in doing so, became it." We boarded the train at midday, London bound. Holmes settled into his seat, eyes once more alight with thought, but not yet at rest. I watched him for a time, unsure whether he was content with the outcome or troubled by it. Perhaps both. After some miles had passed, I asked, "Do you believe justice was done?" Holmes looked out the window. The fields rolled by, green and fading. "Justice, Watson, is rarely perfect, but truth has a way of restoring balance, even when it arrives late and bruised." He turned from the window then, smiled faintly, and reached into his coat for his pipe. "Now," he said, striking a match, "I believe the case of the missing silver foxglove at number 19 Doughty Street still awaits our attention. And unlike Greythorn House, it promises a far less tragic sort of mystery." The rhythm of the train lulled us into silence as it sped toward London, its whistle a plaintive cry against the wind. Holmes reclined in his seat with his eyes half closed, but I knew better than to believe he was resting. His mind was still grinding through the final jagged edges of the Greythorn affair. I could see it in the flecks of his fingers against the window pane, in the slow rise and fall of his breath. Controlled, but never truly idle. After a time he spoke. "You know, Watson, there remains one detail from Greythorn that troubles me." I looked up from my notes, which I had been reviewing in anticipation of composing a full account. "Only one?" "A curious omission, really," he said, sitting forward. Clara confessed, yes, and the evidence against her is compelling. But the moment of Philip's death, the precise moment, remains cloudy. No one saw him fall. No one heard the cry. The wax, the lens, the wire. These were tools of manipulation. But what if he didn't fall because he was frightened or stumbled? What if he was pushed after all? I blinked. "You think someone else was involved?" "I think someone else may have used Clara's manipulation as cover. Think of it, Watson. If you wished to kill and had knowledge of Clara's petty machinations, would it not serve as the perfect distraction? A pre-built theater of guilt, and no one would look beyond her." I leaned back slowly. But who? Someone with access to the stair that night. Someone unafraid to move in darkness, and most importantly, someone who knew about the codicil before Clara. Lady Caroline. He shook his head. Too bound by shame. She shielded Clara, but she never sought to unseat Philip. No, it would have to be someone who knew the financial implications. Someone who stood to benefit directly. He fell silent again, and I let the matter rest. For now. By late afternoon, we were back in Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual brisk kindness, though her face grew briefly pinched when Holmes mentioned the Graythorne name. She said nothing, but I suspected she'd seen the headlines already. Heiress behind staircase tragedy, or some equally sensational drivel. We'd scarcely removed our coats when there came a knock at the door, not firm, but hesitant, the kind that suggested a visitor with something delicate to say. Holmes exchanged a glance with me before striding to answer it himself. The door opened to reveal a woman dressed in black, her cloak modest but of quality. She was in her late 30s, perhaps, with intelligent eyes and a face that bore a certain weariness sharpened by resolve. She carried no bag, no gloves, just a folded paper in one hand. "Mr. Holmes?" she asked. "I'm Miss Evelyn Hargrave." Holmes stepped aside. "Please come in." She seated herself with visible reluctance, as if unsure whether she had come to confess or accuse. "I read of the tragedy at Graythorne," she began. "And I know the name Langdon. I knew Beatrice. She was my mother's cousin, and she entrusted me, years ago, with something I now believe should have gone to the police, but I feared the consequences." She held out the folded paper. Holmes took it and opened it carefully. His eyes scanned it in silence. "It's a copy," she explained, "of the original codicil. Beatrice made one in secret. She gave it to me for safekeeping and told me never to speak of it unless something unforgivable happened." Holmes held the paper toward the firelight and read it again. "This is dated 3 days earlier than the one found in the library." "Yes, because the one you found was a plant. The real one was destroyed years ago. Or so we believed. But Beatrice kept this, out of distrust. She told me she suspected someone in the family would one day try to erase all trace of Clara's lineage." Holmes looked up sharply. "You're saying someone else knew of Clara's parentage all along?" Evelyn Hargrave nodded. "Sir Alistair." The room went utterly still. "He and Beatrice clashed bitterly," she said. "He feared scandal, feared the line of inheritance being questioned. When the previous lord, his father, died, the codicil would have ensured Clara a portion of the estate. Beatrice tried to have it recognized, but Alistair destroyed the evidence. Or so he thought. He threatened Beatrice, forced her to leave. Clara stayed behind, protected under the fiction of being a ward. But Alistair always knew." Holmes stood, pacing slowly. "And Clara never knew this until recently?" "She didn't, but Beatrice had written her a letter shortly before her death. I don't know the contents, but I do know she instructed me to deliver the copy of the codicil if any harm came to Clara or someone she loved." Holmes stopped mid-step. "Philip?" "Yes, I saw his name in the paper, and I knew this was the harm Beatrice feared. I felt my pulse quicken. Then Clara wasn't alone. Alistair may have known she would make a move, or perhaps he planned to use her as a scapegoat." Holmes nodded. "And if he intercepted Beatrice's final letter to Clara, or guessed at its existence, he might have realized Clara was getting close to the truth. He may even have followed her on the night of the murder." He turned abruptly. "Watson, we must return to Graythorne. But the matter is considered closed. Clara is in custody. Then we must act before she is tried and convicted on a half-truth. This is no longer a question of misjudged guilt. It is a matter of concealed murder." Within the hour, we were back on the road, Miss Hargrave in tow, her eyes sharp with the need to see justice delivered. Holmes rode in silence most of the way, breaking it only once to say, "There is a kind of crime, Watson, that cloaks itself in other crimes. The villain waits for someone to make a mistake, then steps through the crack to deliver the fatal blow." Night had fallen when we arrived. Graythorne House loomed, all its windows dark save one. Sir Alistair's study. Holmes did not knock. He walked straight to the door and opened it. Sir Alistair stood at his desk, hands resting on a ledger. He looked up, unsurprised. "You've returned." "We have," Holmes said evenly. "To ask one final question. Where is the letter Beatrice Langdon sent Clara?" Sir Alistair blinked. I don't know of any letter. Holmes smiled faintly. Then I must ask you to prove that. Because unless you can, I believe you not only intercepted it, but used its implications to remove Philip. Alistair's jaw stiffened. I've already endured one investigation, Mr. Holmes. But not the right one, Holmes said. You feared what Philip would do with the truth. Clara frightened him, yes, but it was you who ensured he would never speak again. A quiet step behind him on the stair. One small push. A man already full of doubt needs only a nudge. Alistair said nothing. Miss Hargrave stepped forward. You let Clara take the fall. You let her think her lies killed him. But it was you who broke him, body and soul. Finally, Alistair spoke. She would have ruined everything. You don't understand what it meant to be a Greythorn, to protect the name, to protect the line. Holmes gave a quiet, merciless nod. And in doing so, you shattered it forever. The last lie, like the last stair, had been stepped upon and broken. The fire in Sir Alistair's study crackled softly as silence stretched taut in the wake of Holmes's accusation. Outside, the wind scraped across the frost-bitten lawn like a whisper trying to claw its way into the house. Alistair stood very still, as though the accusation had turned him to stone. His hands were no longer on the ledger, but clasped tightly behind his back, the knuckles pale. He did not deny the charge. Not in words. Holmes stepped slowly into the room. You speak of legacy, Sir Alistair, but all I see is a legacy of concealment and quiet violence. You destroyed the original codicil. You expelled Beatrice Langdon, and when Philip began asking questions, when Clara's presence here began to raise suspicions, you acted again. I did what was necessary, Alistair said, his voice low and controlled. Do you think I wanted this? To carry a secret like that for decades, watching a child grow up unrecognized, unwanted? Clara was never meant to know. Beatrice was warned not to interfere again, but she defied me in the end. She always said the truth would surface, and I saw the danger in her eyes the last time she visited. She would not die with her silence intact. She wrote to Clara, Holmes said, and you intercepted it. Alistair gave a curt nod, almost imperceptible. I retrieved the letter from the post, before it reached her, burned it in the study. I thought that would be the end of it. But Philip, he had the misfortune of uncovering what should have stayed buried. So you used Clara's deception as cover, Holmes said, voice even. You waited until the house was quiet, followed Philip to the stair where he'd often stood and pondered. You saw him alone. Perhaps you feared he would reveal the truth in the morning. Perhaps he'd already told you he would. Alistair closed his eyes for a moment. He said I should come clean, that Clara deserved her name. And you pushed him, Holmes said simply. Sir Alistair didn't answer, but it was no longer necessary. The truth, like the fog outside, had seeped into every corner. Miss Hargrave's voice broke the silence, ragged and trembling. You let her believe it was her fault. Clara, she would have gone to prison believing she killed someone she loved. Alistair's expression did not soften. She did frighten him. The house was already a stage of shadows. I only gave it one final cue. But you took his life, I said, stepping forward, unable to mask the disgust in my tone. You broke more than a legacy, sir. You broke a man, and then you let your niece carry the burden. Holmes turned his attention to the desk. May I? Alistair gave a faint gesture of surrender. Holmes opened the center drawer and drew out a small tin box, locked but unmarked. Without hesitation, he removed a pick from his coat and made quick work of the mechanism. Inside lay the ashes of several papers, and tucked beneath them, a sealed envelope, yellowed but intact. The crest on the flap was unmistakable. The Langdon seal. He held it up. Beatrice's final letter, the one you thought destroyed. I burned it, Alistair said slowly, but she must have left a duplicate. Damn her. Holmes looked at him, then passed the letter to Miss Hargrave without comment. "You understand," Holmes said softly, "that this must be turned over to the authorities." Alistair gave a single nod. "You may do what you like." He sank into the armchair near the fire, and for the first time since we'd arrived, he looked less like a lord and more like a man who had already sentenced himself. By morning, the local magistrate had been summoned once again. Clara, already in custody, would be spared further prosecution, her false confession retracted. Her role, though serious, had not resulted in death. That had been Sir Alistair's doing, his final act in a long play of quiet tyranny. The house was eerily subdued as we made our preparations to leave a second time. No one moved through its halls save the staff, walking softly as though in mourning. Lady Caroline did not appear. Ellerby had already departed at first light, wordlessly. Only Miss Hargrave remained, seated by the window with a letter on her lap, staring not at its words, but at the frost patterns on the glass. As Holmes and I stepped into the cold morning air, she followed us to the door. "Thank you," she said simply. Holmes bowed. "Clara may not have the Greythorn name," he said, "but she deserves what it owes her." Miss Hargrave's face hardened. "I will see to it that she gets it." We boarded the carriage and made our way down the winding path that led from the estate, now touched by the grey fingers of winter. Holmes was quiet until we reached the station. He lit a cigarette, but didn't smoke it, letting it burn slowly between his fingers. "So many families," he said, "think the past is something they can store in locked drawers and boarded rooms. But the past is never truly still, Watson. It leaks." He flicked the cigarette into the slush beside the platform and turned to me. "It seeps through time in half-truths and whispers, and if not reckoned with, it demands its price in tragedy." The train pulled into the station, a hiss of steam rising like a sigh. "And Clara?" I asked as we stepped aboard. "She will have a difficult road ahead," Holmes said. "But she will walk it as herself now. That is more than most of them ever did." He glanced once through the window as the train pulled away, back toward the house on the hill where the fog still clung to the trees, and the West Stair now stood silent and bare in the grey light of justice. Then he turned from it and, folding his arms, closed his eyes. Not in rest, but in readiness, as always, for the next mystery waiting just beyond the veil. We returned to Baker Street under a thick canopy of low grey clouds, the sky pressed down over London like a lid. Holmes said little on the journey. Once or twice I saw him sketch invisible diagrams with his index finger against the fogged train window, a sign that his thoughts were still moving, always a step ahead, always testing some final angle. Back in our sitting room, he dropped into his chair with the exhaustion that followed a case not of complexity alone but of emotional depth. There was a difference, I had learned, between solving a crime and unraveling a life. The Greythorn affair had done both. I poured him a brandy, and he accepted it silently, staring into the fire. After a time, he said, "I cannot help but wonder if Clara will recover." "She is free, Holmes," I said. "Cleared of murder. That must count for something." "But not of guilt," he replied. "Not in her own mind. She laid the groundwork for Philip's fall, even if she did not intend his death. Her conscience will not be so easily exonerated." There was truth in that, and I could not argue it. Still, there was relief in knowing that the real murderer would be held accountable. Sir Alistair's confession had been formally given to the magistrate that morning, and a detachment from Hampshire Constabulary would take him into custody within the week. He had not attempted to flee, nor had he asked for a solicitor. When Holmes and I left him, he had looked out the window of his study with the calm of a man finally unburdened by the weight of a lie he had carried too long. I thought the matter done. But Holmes, as ever, was unwilling to rest until the case was turned on all sides, until the last unexplained thread was wound back into the tapestry. "Something still disturbs me, Watson," he said later that evening, turning from the fire. Surely not another suspect, I said half in jest. Number, but a final detail. The shard, I looked up from my notes. The glass shard in Philip's hand, Holmes continued. It was planted, yes. But by whom? Clara believed she had used it in her deception, but she confessed to placing it earlier, 2 nights before the fall. Yet the fragment was found embedded in Philip's palm as though pressed in at the time of death. You think it was moved? That someone placed it deliberately? I think someone, not Clara, ensured it was there when the body was found. He stood and began pacing, the lines in his brow deepening. Sir Alistair would have had motive, but would he have the foresight? Number reacted in the moment, I believe. An impulsive decision born of panic or frustration. But the shard, that was preparation. It suggests calculation. I stood slowly. Holmes, are you saying there was another hand at work? Someone who intended Philip's death before the final push? Not necessarily. But I believe someone in that house expected death and prepared for it to appear accidental. The lens shard was insurance. Then who? I asked. Lady Caroline, Professor Ellerby. Holmes didn't answer. He stopped by the bookshelf, finger tracing the spine of a volume absently. I believe it was someone with knowledge of optics, someone who knew how such a shard would behave, and how it would implicate no one clearly, but cast a haze over the entire scene. He turned back toward me. We must speak to Ellerby again. Ellerby left Greythorn, I reminded him. He said he had lectures to resume. Holmes gave a humorless smile. Then we'll interrupt his syllabus. 2 mornings later, we arrived at St. John's College in Oxford. The campus lay under brittle sunlight, its quiet cloisters and echoing arches a world apart from the shadows of Hampshire. Professor Julian Ellerby's rooms were tucked on the 2nd floor of the West Quadrangle, modest but immaculately kept. He received us with the surprise of a man who suspects he may not yet be done with something he hoped was behind him. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, this is unexpected. Holmes stepped inside without invitation. Only to you, Professor. Not to me. Ellerby closed the door. Then this isn't a courtesy call. No, Holmes said plainly. It's a question of timing, of knowledge. Of one small curved shard of glass. Ellerby stiffened. We've been over this. Clara took it. No, Professor, Holmes said softly. She took a lens. Not that lens. Ellerby's lips parted slightly. Holmes continued, stepping closer. The shard found in Philip's palm was a portion of a dioptric lens. Used in telescope calibration, yes, but more commonly in visual distortion demonstrations, a specialty of yours. More specifically, the edge of a convex trial lens. Ellerby said nothing. You had motive, Holmes said. Not for murder, but for manipulation. Philip's interest in your theories, his persistent questions, perhaps even his amusement at them. You knew Clara was staging an illusion. You saw an opportunity to construct your own, a more refined one. Perhaps you believed it would push Philip toward retreat or reflection. Perhaps you thought a fall would never happen. But once it did, you said nothing. Ellerby lowered his gaze. He came to me the night before, angry. Said I was filling Clara's head with dangerous ideas. He accused me of giving her the lens. Did you? I told her where one could be found, that's all. But you prepared the shard. Ellerby looked up. Yes, he said. I did. I kept it in my pocket. I intended to leave it near the stair, just as a subtle touch. A suggestion, nothing more. But when I arrived, he was already dead, and I panicked. I pressed it into his palm. I drew breath. Holmes closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. Why? Because I knew how it would look. That if the death were ruled an accident, the inquiries would stop, but if it were murder, I feared I would be blamed. Clara, too. So I helped the illusion, and then stayed silent. Holmes gave a long exhale. You turned a tragic death into a puppet show. You layered fiction upon fiction, and in doing so, you obscured the path of truth for everyone. I didn't mean for him to die, Ellaby said. No, Holmes agreed, but you still played your part in his fall. We left without another word. As we descended the stone steps of the quadrangle, Holmes removed his gloves slowly, his face unreadable. It seems, he said at last, that everyone in that house carried a hand in the illusion, even those who believed themselves innocent. And now, I asked. Now, Holmes said, the law will weigh their guilt, each according to their deed. But the truth, at last, is whole. We turned down the path beneath the archway, the shadows stretching long behind us as the bells of St. John's began to toll. By the time we returned to Baker Street from Oxford, dusk had once again settled over the city. The gas lamps flared against the early evening gloom, their glow hazy in the drizzle that had begun to fall. London, with all its grime and noise and indifferent crowds, felt almost comforting after the heavy atmospheres of Greythorne and the cloisters of St. John's. Holmes removed his coat and hat with habitual efficiency, and immediately crossed to the fireplace, standing in stillness before it, hands clasped behind his back. I saw the familiar signs, shoulders rigid, jaw tight, eyes unfocused, not of indecision, but of a mind turning the final revolutions of a case that had cost him more than he would admit aloud. I poured 2 brandies, one of which he accepted silently. After a long sip, I ventured, "Do you think the courts will pursue Ellaby?" Holmes's brow furrowed. They must. His hand did not strike the blow, but he shaped the stage. It is a difficult matter, morally, legally. He did not kill Philip, but his interference sealed the illusion. His act may not meet the threshold for murder, but it borders, at the very least, on criminal misdirection. And Clara? She will not be charged. The magistrate has the true timeline now, and her actions, while reckless, did not directly cause the fall. She remains culpable in conscience only. He moved to the window and looked out over Baker Street, which bustled with its usual traffic, none the wiser to the tangle of deception, inheritance, and guilt we had just unraveled. "What haunts me, Watson," he said quietly, "is that Philip might have lived if any one of them had acted differently. Clara, Ellaby, Alistair, each played a part, not out of malice, but out of fear. And yet their silence, their illusions, their pride, those were the true culprits." I nodded, knowing the weight of that realization would not leave him soon. For all Holmes's brilliance, for all his detachment, he was never immune to the quiet tragedies that lay beneath the logic. The next morning brought a letter, hand-delivered, sealed in pale blue wax. It was addressed in a careful, precise hand to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. He opened it without a word and read in silence. Then, with a faint flicker of surprise, passed it to me. The contents were as follows. "Mr. Holmes, I write only to express something I failed to say in person. It may surprise you to know that I am not angry for having been caught. What I feel is something quieter, duller, relief perhaps. I spent my life shaping the Greythorne name into something that would endure. I believed this required deception, sacrifice, control. But I see now it was already broken before I ever took the helm. It was Beatrice who knew the truth, not I. And in trying to silence her, I silenced what little honor our name might have had left. Clara will receive what is rightfully hers. I have left instructions. She may never forgive me, but perhaps in time she will understand. Tell Dr. Watson he was right. I did break something, more than a man. I broke a family, and I do not expect repair. Alistair Greythorne." I folded the letter and set it down slowly. Holmes said, nothing for a time then, as if the matter were finally sealed, turned and reached for his violin. He tuned it in brief silence, then drew the bow slowly across the strings, producing a long, aching note. "She will understand," he murmured at last. "But she will not forget." The following days passed without incident. Holmes took on a minor matter concerning a stolen brooch in Kensington. Child's play, really, and he seemed to regard it as such, solving it within 2 visits and a pair of telegrams. But I saw the residual shadows of Graythorne linger in his expression. He did not say it aloud, but I knew he was still troubled by the idea of truth being warped, not by lies alone, but by partial truths, by omissions, misdirections, and emotional cowardice. We received one final letter a week later, this one from Miss Evelyn Hargrave. "Dear Mr. Holmes, Clara has chosen to leave Graythorne. I believe the house is too heavy with memory. She has taken a position in Devon with a family friend of Beatrice's. A governess role, ironically enough. She seems lighter. I believe she will be all right. Lady Caroline has withdrawn from public view. Whether in shame or grief I cannot say, but I believe she too carries remorse more painful than any punishment. The solicitor has confirmed that a portion of the estate will be redirected to Clara, per Sir Alister's final codicil. Not enough to replace what was lost, but enough to begin again. Thank you for everything. The truth, in the end, mattered. Yours, E. H. Holmes read the letter twice, then placed it carefully among his case files. Not in the pile of solved affairs, I noted, but in the drawer marked miscellaneous matters. A quiet nod, perhaps, to the case's refusal to remain cleanly solved. That evening, as we sat by the fire with the lamplight flickering low, I asked the final question still troubling me. Holmes, if Philip had lived, if he had taken the letter to the authorities, if he had exposed Clara's birthright himself, what do you think would have happened? Holmes tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair. That, Watson, is the irony. I believe Philip would have helped her. He was no villain. His initial shock would have given way to protection, perhaps even advocacy. But fear poisons more than hate does. Clara feared rejection. Alistair feared scandal. Ellerby feared implication. And so, in a house where no one dared to speak first, the truth drowned in silence. He exhaled, then reached again for his violin. This time the melody was lighter, still tinged with melancholy, but resolved somehow. A final note at the end of a long and painful movement. And thus, the case of the marks on the moonlit stair came to an end, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with truth. A fragile, complicated truth, wrested from shadows and shaped by the light of reason. Holmes had followed the trail to its last step. What remained was the echo of it, soft, lingering, and unforgettable. The last pages of a case, like the final strokes of a composition, must not only complete but clarify. And it was with this aim that Holmes spent one final evening, several weeks after the conclusion of the Graythorne matter, reviewing the entire sequence of events by candlelight in our sitting room. The case was, in every official sense, closed. Sir Alister had been remanded into custody, where he awaited trial for manslaughter under a cloud of reluctant scandal. Professor Ellerby had been quietly dismissed from his lectureship. Though no charges were brought, the stain on his name would not fade. Clara had indeed taken up her post in Devon, and from what little correspondence Miss Hargrave forwarded, it seemed she was adjusting to a life free from shadows, though not yet from sorrow. But Holmes had one last detail to test, one small lingering splinter that refused to settle. "Watson," he said that night, breaking the silence as I dozed lightly by the fire, "do you recall the wax on the upper stair rail?" I blinked myself awake. Yes, of course. It was the first thing we found at Graythorne, melted traces near the landing. And the wire, placed in the grooves along the banister. Yes. Holmes leaned forward, fingers steepled. They were always too meticulous for Clara. Her efforts were crude, childhood ghost stories in physical form. But the wax and wire, they were elegant, designed not to scare, but to simulate accident, Someone had not just prepared the illusion of a haunting, but laid the groundwork for a fatal fall before Clara began her charade. "You believe someone else began it?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "that someone led Clara toward the performance, subtly, suggestively, as though helping her play a role that was already being written." He rose, retrieved a small envelope from the case file, and removed a fragment of paper, torn, yellowed at the edge. "I had this tested by a handwriting expert," he said. "It is part of a letter, unsigned, unaddressed, but recovered from the refuse bin outside the West Tower Observatory. Burned at the corner, but intact enough to reveal several words." He handed it to me. I read the partial lines aloud. "If you truly want him to fear what he cannot explain, there is an angle of moonlight that strikes just so. A wire placed low would never be seen. He must doubt himself first, and then doubt everything." I looked up. "Ellerby." Holmes nodded once. He did more than simply observe Clara's deception. He nurtured it, coached her, fed her ideas couched in academic detachment. Perhaps he meant only to unseat Philip, perhaps even hoped to frighten him away from Greythorn. But he planted in her the tools of fear, and then stood back to watch the results unfold. He returned to his chair, his voice cooling. "Ellerby will not face trial, Watson. But he is the most dangerous sort, one who commits his crimes with the hands of others. Alistair acted out of desperation, Clara out of confusion, but Ellerby—" He watched, measured, and interfered just enough to let tragedy take shape. "You think he wanted Philip dead?" Holmes shook his head. "I think he wanted Philip gone. Perhaps to elevate Clara, perhaps to right what he viewed as an injustice, perhaps only to prove the power of psychological manipulation. But once Philip fell, he chose to conceal. That makes him, if not the architect of death, then its willing spectator." I sat quietly, absorbing the weight of this final layer. It was not often Holmes allowed the tale to end with so murky a judgment. He prized clarity, but he respected complexity. "The law won't touch him," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "But minds such as Ellerby's often outlast their own conscience. He will punish himself far more subtly than any jury." The fire crackled low in the grate. Holmes rose, paced to the window, and looked out over the lamplit street. Below, life moved on. Vendors closing stalls, carriages clattering past, children in mufflers chasing one another home. The world did not pause for grief or revelation. He spoke without turning. "The marks on the moonlit stair, Watson, were not just the traces of hands or candle wax. They were the signs of fear, ambition, guilt, and silence. A family tried to hide a legacy it could not bear, and in doing so, gave birth to fictions more dangerous than any truth." He looked back at me, the gleam of firelight in his eyes. But in the end, it was not the moonlight that betrayed them. It was the stair itself. Solid, practical, unchanging. They tried to make it tell a story of ghosts and madness. But it told only what it had seen. The descent of a man, step by step, toward a death prepared not by one hand, but many. And with that, Holmes turned from the window, extinguished the lamp with a flick of his fingers, and said no more. But I, ever his chronicler, would remember every step, every mark. For some truths, once uncovered, refuse to be buried again, 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 to be buried again,